So you said it was a mix of fear and hope. So fear of nuclear weapons, but also hope. In the book, though, you call it delusional. Like it's a pretty harsh assessment that every presidential administration.
You could take this as a mixed bag. Okay, it's like some people delude themselves more than others. I think after at some point, if not at 2008, by the time you get to 2014, there probably should have been a thoughtful decision made about supporting Ukraine to warn off additional Russian aggression. So there are different kinds of delusions representing these, singular and unique personalities. But yes, we were we missed the boat on how far Russia was willing to go, how aggressive it was going to be, how much we could accomplish with Russia along the way.
Okay, let's get to the larger thesis of tonight's show, and it is taken from your book, and that is The Folly of Realism, How the West Deceived Itself About Russia and Betrayed Ukraine. And in it, you argue that this didn't just happen in 2022. This has been brewing for some 30 years since the fall of the Soviet Union, since the Declaration of Independence from Ukraine. And you say that since then, the US and the West have made some fatal mistakes would that have brought the war that we see today. And I want to go back to the beginning, not the beginning, but the beginning 30 years ago, the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 during George H.W. Bush's administration. And then, of course, the Declaration of Independence from various former Soviet republics. So, what was the initial Bush administration response?
I think it was first. I would just categorize it as pretty deep apprehension. In certain regards, the late Soviet Union under Mikhail Gorbachev was a state in which there was uh, some meeting of the minds, and I think there was a devil mentality, even though it was an ideological adversary versus the fear of the unknown. And the way that the administration kind of came around to some of these, worst case scenarios is they looked at the devolution of the Soviet bloc starting in 1989. They looked at what happened, for instance, in Yugoslavia with the kind of the wars and flashpoints occurring there. And they were deeply afraid of a scenario in which the Soviet Union ended up like Yugoslavia, but with nuclear weapons. So there was a group commissioned by Robert Gates, at that time, the Deputy National Security Advisor. Condoleezza Rice featured in that group. Um, a group of other folks that would later be kind of part of the neocon cohort. They participated in these meetings, and they looked at a scenario in which the USSR fragmented, and there was nuclear proliferation, so multiple nuclear states emerging. Of course, when the Soviet Union fell apart, you had Russia, you had Belarus, you had Ukraine and Kazakhstan inherit nuclear arsenals. Ukraine actually became this third largest nuclear power in the world with over 4,000 nuclear weapons. So they were afraid of nuclear proliferation. And they were also afraid of a loose nuke scenario in which it was, just complete total chaos, and nuclear weapons or nuclear materials would kind of flow freely around the world and fall into the hands of terrorists and things of that nature. So that's what governed the decision making of the George H.W. Bush administration with regard to the Soviet Union. And one of the most illuminating moments was just months before the Soviet Union collapsed. George H.W. Bush travels to Kiev and gives this infamous Chicken Kiev speech, in which he basically says, "Yes, I know that you want your independence. You've been struggling for it. He may have not known that it was a centuries long struggle, but he knew that they were struggling for it. But don't rush towards, independence."
Hi, I'm Pat Morrison, one of the hosts of America at a Crossroads. If you like this video, don't just watch. Head over to our website where you can subscribe for early access to new programs, see our upcoming schedules, and connect directly with our guests in our weekly live streams. Thank you for watching.
They voted overwhelmingly. 90% of the population voted to break free. So that was one of the key moments, framing a scenario in which we basically sided with Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union to figure out a way to denuclearize these states and turn over them nuclear weapons, including concerted pressure between Russia and the U.S. at one point to pressure the Ukrainians to give up nuclear weapons. So that was the start of the story, with this Russia first kind of Moscow focused approach.
Isn't it also that they were actually just looking at the safety of the United States and wanting to make sure that there wouldn't be another nuclear war or some kind of
Yeah.
nuclear conflagration? And, 2020 hindsight, yeah, okay. But at the time, who knew, right?
Yep. So I tend to be pretty forgiving of the policymakers in that era, whether it's George W. Bush or Bill Clinton afterwards. And as I thought about it, I was like, these are brilliant practitioners, so they couldn't have been all wrong about how to deal with this. And what I would say is that in the 90s, the policymakers fell victim to hopes and fears. The fears we discussed, the idea of nuclear proliferation, loose nukes, and things of that nature, and hopes. And some, I'd say those hopes were probably justified. As you pointed out, we were coming out of a Cold War, 40 years of existential a threat of nuclear Armageddon. And at the same time, both Gorbachev and Yeltsin promised a different view, different world in which Russia would be a net contributor. Russia would, and it would be a pan-European security architecture and things of that nature. So yes, it was the seed of a very Russia focused, but I'd say at that moment it was probably excusable and understandable given the situation. What becomes less understandable and less forgivable is as time progresses and Russia shows its colors. Russia engages in aggression. People forget about the fact that there were multiple frozen conflicts in Russia's backyard, where it sent in purported peacekeepers really to lock in its own influence, whether that's in Georgia, in Moldova, in other corners of the world. Russia's Chechen war, the way Russia, kind of supported genocide in the former Yugoslavian territories by Serbian strongmen and things of that nature. After a while, it became less understandable. There was no promise of a pan-European security, but we still kind of grasp at that mirage. And at the same time, we've always kind of fallen victim, even under the Biden administration after the war started. We were part of the reason that we were slow to support Ukraine was because we thought that somehow could provoke Russia into a confrontation and take us on the road to nuclear war. But again, a false understanding because Russia has zero interest in tangling with the US directly. They have a very, very healthy respect for the United States and will do everything. They'll dance around the issue, they'll provoke, but they will do nothing to provoke a direct confrontation with the United States because they understand conventionally they could be destroyed, and then that automatically graduates to nuclear war, and that's mutually assured destruction. So I would say that just to take it back to the point you made, I think it's some of the seeds of this kind of prototypical fear and hope reaction have been there, planted in the early days and continue through, rationalizable, understandable in the early days. But frankly, by the time you get through the 90s, really hard to kind of to accept. And certainly by the time you get to 2004 and Russia's graduation from mischief making, coercion, like it plays the hegemon in its own neighborhood, to hybrid warfare, and then graduates in Georgia to military aggression, we should have tacked to a much more resolved position, supporting our allies in the region and warning Russia about the folly of its approach. And we didn't. And that's in part the folly of realism. We kind of were very, very short term and transactional instead of looking at the big picture and long term.
What was the turning point? Did you think was it Georgia with the invasion there and the annexation of some parts of Georgia? Would you think that was the red line?
I would say that certainly the warning signs after Ukraine in 2004 were there. The rhetoric started to sharply escalate from Russia because it could see Ukraine pulling away. And so I think after this moment, Russia pivots to defining itself in opposition to the West. saying that the U.S. And the West are, engineering these color revolutions. Very quickly, Putin gives this infamous speech to his Duma, his parliament in 2005. In 2007, there's this whole fracas at the Munich Security Conference and a confrontation between Secretary Gates at that point and Putin. And then very shortly thereafter, you've got Russia's attack in 2008. So it was, even if we miss these individual moments between 2004 and 2008, the signs and signals are there. And what do we do instead? We sought for opportunities to reset and normalize and see if we could grasp at these hopes and mitigate these fears without demonstrating the resolve to support our allies and partners.
So you said it was a mix of fear and hope. So fear of nuclear weapons, but also hope. In the book, though, you call it delusional. Like it's a pretty harsh assessment that every presidential administration since 1990 has been deluded about Russia. And what is the delusion when we in fact know what Putin, we have a lot of good intelligence about what Putin has done, and including assassinating people harshly with, trying to, in the case of a former president of Ukraine, um, poison him when he's disfigured. And so we know what he's capable of. And yet there's this feeling that, oh, he's maybe not as bad as he seems. Well, what is the delusion here when it
Hmm.
comes?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that I would say is that one of the reasons that we've given Russia such a singular place is that we bought into this sense of exceptionalism that Russia kind of demands and evangelizes. So that sense of exceptionalism, in part feeds off the fact that Russia is the largest territory by size. It was, once held to be one of the largest and most powerful militaries in the world. Prior to 2022, it was the second most powerful military in the world. It had a massive nuclear arsenal. It had a dominating, if not entirely dominant, a central position in oil and gas trades and things of that nature. But Russia was by no means anything close to the Soviet Union. It's a shadow of the Soviet Union, and certainly Russia didn't have I mean, it could play at best, really, oftentimes the part of the spoiler without necessarily following through. So I think that's buying into that exceptionalism has been a part of it. I think that certainly, I mean, we take some of the president's words at face value. Uh, at one point, George Bush the younger professed to look into Putin's eyes and see his soul. And this is in the relatively early days, um, in the early 2000s, instead of the KGB case officer that had likely, in order to come to power, conducted bombings of his own city, or of Moscow rather, in order to secure his role and start a second Chechen war. So I think we have been quite I mean, nobody deludes themselves more than you could take this as a mixed bag. Okay, so some people delude themselves more than others. I mean, Donald Trump thinks that this guy is his best friend, and that Putin, crazy or not, I forgot the words he used. It was on that hot mic. He was like, "This guy is willing to make a deal for me." I mean, that's pretty delusional, right? But so I think there's a range of delusion. Some folks probably had a much more, kind of stark, or a much more kind of, I'd say, thoughtful interpretation. When I interviewed Bill Clinton for this book, he was quite caught, and the overlap was really limited. He was quite cautious of Vladimir Putin initially and tried to warn George Bush about it. I'd say President Obama was, if he was delusional, it was in the fact that he was dismissive of the amount of trouble Putin could cause. He thought that this could be easily managed, and Russia could be put in the box, and we didn't have to do anything to support our allies. I mean, I think after at some point, if not at 2008, by the time you get to 2014, there probably should have been a thoughtful decision made about supporting Ukraine to warn off additional Russian aggression. So there are different kinds of delusions representing these, singular and unique personalities. But yes, we were we missed the boat on how far Russia was willing to go, how aggressive it was going to be, how much we could accomplish with Russia along the way.
And definitely tune in next week to hear what Mike Mullen has to say about this and other topics of national security interest. And I will see you again sometime in the near future. Have a great night.